I found the truth sealed inside a miniature oak barrel my father left buried in the defunct irrigation pump shed. Behind a false wall he labeled, "Sulfur Application Logs, 1987. By the time I was done, my brother-in-law was serving a federal fraud sentence, stripped of every asset, then paroled directly into my custody wearing a high-visibility shirt that said "Crushed Trust" on the back, stomping grapes in an open-air concrete lager while tourists took selfies on the tasting deck. Every single bottle of our estate wine now prints his case number on the label in gold foil. Here is exactly how that happened. I was a registered nurse for 32 years. I worked the overnight shift in a rural hospital cardiac unit, the kind of place where the hallway lights hum at a frequency that becomes your resting heartbeat, and where the smell of isopropyl alcohol and stale coffee seeps into the seams of your scrubs. You learn to read a doctor's handwriting before the pharmacy catches a fatal dosage, and you can thread an 18-gauge Roman IV catheter into a rolling, dehydrated vein while a patient screams that you're worthless, all without your own pulse climbing above 60. I mention that because later, when I had to study a forged signature under a desk lamp, pick a 5-pin tumbler lock in 90 seconds, and spot the font kern differences between a real notarization and a Photoshop tracing, it wasn't bravery or anger that carried me. It was 32 years of trained hypervigilance, a pension I drained to zero, and one impossible debt of love to a man who taught me that grapes only grow where the roots suffer. My father, George, had spent his retirement tending a derelict 40-acre vineyard in the Columbia Valley. The land was rocky basalt scree that shattered a standard T-post driver. The irrigation pipes rusted through in 3 separate frost heaves, and the old Chardonnay vines had mostly gone feral, sending out weak shoots that produced clusters of sour, bird-pecked fruit. After my mother died, he poured every dime of his machinist's pension into that slope, rebuilding the trellis system with galvanized steel wire he bought at auction, and installing a gravity-fed drip system he designed himself on graph paper. I was the one who drove an hour each weekend to sit with him in the bed of his pickup, splitting a ham sandwich while he pointed at the south-facing slope and said, "See that rust? That's character, Lena. The juice doesn't care how pretty the steel is." My older sister Diane never visited. She said the dust ruined her highlights and the sulfur spray gave her migraines. Her husband, Marshall, my brother-in-law, came exactly once, took a property tax assessment and a soil sample, and left. That detail pays off. When Dad got sick, pancreatic cancer, 6 months to live, I took a family medical leave from the hospital and moved into the old farmhouse. The week before he died, he called me into his room at the very hospice wing where I'd once trained as a student nurse. His voice was a dry whisper that smelled of the morphine infuser taped to his arm. He made me lift the loose floorboard under the visitor chair, the one that had always squeaked if you stepped left of the nightstand. Underneath was a miniature wine barrel, about the size of a football, sealed with burgundy wax and a tight wooden bung. He pressed a small iron key into my palm, the one from his cigar box. "That barrel is your real last will," he said. "Don't open it until they show you what they really are, and never, ever let your sister near the root cellar." The key fit a lock on a chest I'd later find, but the barrel itself would need a utility knife. I promised. He died holding my hand on a Tuesday morning at 8:47 a.m., the exact moment the automatic drip irrigation kicked on outside his window. I heard the sprinklers sputter to life as his pulse faded under my thumb. The vultures circled before the funeral home confirmed the memorial arrangements. Diane arrived in a white Escalade with paper dealer plates on a lease she didn't qualify for, wearing a black wrap dress she must have dry cleaned while dabbing her eyes for the cameras. Marshall strode in behind her, phone already pressed to his ear, using words like brand valuation and exit multiples with the casual arrogance of a man who had never fermented a single grape, but now referred to the vineyard as our family legacy. He hugged me too hard, his cologne settling into the wool of my morning cardigan like a chemical spill, and said, "Oh, Lena, you look so worn down. Let us handle everything now." Diane patted my shoulder. "We're going to take care of you, sweetie. You just rest." I nodded, shoulders slumped forward, playing the foggy, grieving sister who could barely find her car keys in her own purse. Inside, my heartbeat had shifted into a slow, deliberate rhythm I recognized from the worst code blues, the ones where you know the crash cart isn't going to be enough, and you start mentally inventorying the mistakes people make when they panic. Within 2 days, They had commandeered the dining room to sort through Dad's papers. Marshall spread manila folders across the table like a foreclosure auctioneer, waving a handful of documents at me without letting me see the pages. "Just old tax records, nothing you need to worry about," he said, his thumb covering the title of an LLC operating agreement. Diane kept piling Dad's personal effects into black contractor bags destined for the landfill. His reading glasses, his leather wallet with the fishing license photo, the framed certificate from his 40 years at the precision tooling plant. That's when I saw her pick up a dusty wooden box from the credenza. It was my father's old cigar box, the one he'd brought back from a trip to the Yakima Valley years before I was born. Inside, I knew he kept a small leather-bound notebook and an iron key. Diane shook it, heard the rattle of the key, wrinkled her nose, and said, "Junk! That dust is gonna give me hives." She tossed it toward the trash pile with a backhanded flick of her wrist. I waited until she left to use the bathroom, and using the same calm, deliberate movement I'd once used to remove a surgical drain without waking a patient, I palmed the box off the top of the pile and slipped it into the deep pocket of my coat. Upstairs in the bathroom, I locked the door and turned on the exhaust fan and the faucet to mask the sound of my breathing. I opened the box with trembling fingers. The notebook was a simple ledger, college-ruled, filled with my father's cramped capital letters in black ballpoint, columns of vineyard expenses spanning decades. Irrigation fittings $47, $83, Trellis wire 300 FT $112, Marshall soil test $0 took sample. At the very back, on a page that had a faint water stain shaped like our county, he had written in heavy black marker, the kind where you can feel the fiber indentations, "Lena, if you're reading this, they've already tried to take the land. Do not trust them. Marshall forged your signature on a dissolution document. The real contract is in the barrel. Save yourself." Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that a lifetime of quiet integrity is worth more than any inheritance someone tries to steal with a forged pen stroke. I flushed the toilet and slowly, deliberately, washed my hands until the water turned warm, using the time to slow my breathing. My father had just sent me a dead man's switch from the grave, and I needed to become invisible to the two people who were already spending money they didn't have. I came downstairs looking even more bewildered, touching the wall as if for balance, and letting my voice catch on simple words. Diane and Marshall exchanged a glance that looked like a coordinated asset transfer. "We've been talking," Diane began, her voice a professionally sympathetic hum she must have practiced from daytime television, "and we truly think it's best if you come stay with us for a while. You shouldn't be alone in this big house, not after everything. Marshall can handle the estate paperwork. You just need to sign a few routine documents so we can protect Dad's legacy." "Protect," I repeated softly, as if testing a new word in a foreign language. "I can't even find the power bill, Diane. I keep forgetting where I put things." Marshall stepped closer, invading my personal space with a rehearsed warmth that radiated from his expensive dental veneers. "That's exactly why we need a durable power of attorney, Lena, just to pay the bills and keep the lights on. Nothing that changes who owns anything. You would still have your full stake in the vineyard. We would never touch that." He said it with such unwavering eye contact that I believed he practiced in front of a mirror, probably right after flossing. My stake, the 40% equity I had purchased nearly 10 years earlier by draining my entire nursing pension, $110,000, into their joint venture LLC. I had signed a notarized operating agreement with Marshall in a beige bank office that smelled of photocopier toner and industrial carpet glue. It granted me exactly 40% of the vineyard's assets, plus a lifetime supply of estate wines. Marshall was the managing member. I was a passive investor. Dad had co-signed as a guarantor on the property deed to make the original bank acquisition loan possible, which gave him a legal tie to the title that survived his death. I knew all that because I am a nurse, not an accountant, but I had read every single line of that 24-page operating agreement while Marshall sighed and tapped his watch. I also knew that if he had indeed forged a dissolution, he needed my wet ink signature on a notarized certificate and my physical presence at the title company that held the original deed. No electronic notary acceptable under the LLC's own rules. Without that, any sale of the brand or grapes could be voided. He was trying to trick a grieving woman into sealing her own financial destruction, and he assumed I was too foggy to even notice. I let them move me into their Spanish-style McMansion perched on a ridge above the valley. The house had an 8-car motor court, a saltwater infinity pool, and more square footage of heated limestone tile than the entire cardiac wing where I used to work. My room was the guest suite, which had no lock on the door, a window that couldn't open more than 4 inches, and a direct sightline from the kitchen island, where Diane held Instagram live streams about authentic wine country living, while wearing a sun hat that still had the price tag buttoned inside the brim. I unpacked a single bag and placed a framed photo of Dad holding a cluster of Cabernet Franc as the only personal item on the nightstand. The sealed barrel from the pump shed. I had retrieved it earlier that same night, the very evening of the funeral arrangement confrontation, before anyone thought to check. Dad had hidden it inside the defunct irrigation pump shed at the far corner of the north field, behind a sheet of plywood he'd screwed into the studs and painted over with the words, "Sulfur Application Logs 1987, in fading Sharpie. I had used a cordless drill from his tool bench to remove the screws, lifted the barrel from its dusty nest of old mildewed burlap sacks, and wrapped it in a moving blanket from the truck. It was heavy, maybe 18 pounds, and the wax seal was still thick and uncracked. I stored it in the spare tire well of my old Subaru, under the carpeted cargo cover, parked inside their garage with a gray car cover draped over it. For 3 weeks, I played the part of a tremulous, foggy invalid. I ate their pre-portioned meal delivery, I watched their basic cable television with the volume too low to follow, and I asked permission before adjusting the thermostat by a single degree. Meanwhile, I listened. Marshall's phone rang at odd hours, often after 10 p.m., and each time he'd glance at the caller ID, his jaw tightening and disappear into his home office, closing the double doors with a magnetic seal that clicked like a bank vault. One night, I positioned myself in the laundry room adjacent to that office, where the dryer vent left a small gap in the wall that transmitted sound like a tin can telephone. I heard him say, No, she's not capable of even finding a pen right now. She can't remember what day it is. I'll have her signature by Friday. Just close the deal with the conglomerate. Tell Crescent Valley Wine Group the due diligence period is a formality. It's just a paperwork drill. Crescent Valley Wine Group. I knew that name from the regional wine trade journals Dad used to stack by the fireplace. They were an aggressive corporate buyer that had been swallowing independent vineyards all over the Pacific Northwest, paying inflated prices for established brands they could gut and refill with bulk juice from the Central Valley, keeping the labels and the shelf space while erasing everything the founder had built. I also heard the rising panic in a later call, when Marshall's voice went from oily to sharp. The person on the other end was demanding the original property title and the LLC resolution minutes from the filing company. Marshall started pacing, his Gucci loafers making a frantic arrhythmic tapping against the limestone. I heard him say, "Look, the title company is being difficult. They want a physical appearance, something about a guarantor deed restriction, I don't know, some old man clause, but I can get her there. I just need more time." The financial red flags multiplied like bacteria on a blood culture agar. A FedEx envelope arrived requiring a signature, which Marshall signed in a huff and then took to the guest bathroom, where he shredded it by hand and flushed the pieces piecemeal, believing no one would notice. I noticed. I retrieved a damp strip the size of a playing card, the laser-printed fragment reading, accelerated default clause, and a partial account number from a hard money lender based in a Nevada strip mall. A missed mortgage payment notice for their own home arrived in the mail, which I saw while tidying the kitchen island, the delinquency marked in a bold red rectangle. Meanwhile, Diane ordered a $6,000 crystal chandelier from a designer website and arranged for white glove delivery to the foyer, telling me airily, "This house just needs a little sparkle." The pressure was crushing them, and every hour they spent waiting for my signature was an hour the debt collectors tightened the noose. Then came the household accident that gave me my operational door. One morning, the kitchen garbage disposal jammed so violently that murky, gray, food-flecked water backed up through both sinks and started flooding the limestone floor like a slow-motion spill in the ore. Diane shrieked as if she'd seen a snake. Marshall stood in the middle of the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear with a lender on the line, and shouted, "I don't know how to fix that. Call a plumber." At no one in particular. I walked in, quiet as ever, and said, "I can take a look." I located the breaker panel in the garage, flipped off the disposal circuit, and returned to the sink. I reached under the basin with the hex wrench I'd seen tucked in the junk drawer near the takeout menus, inserted it into the center socket on the bottom of the disposal unit, and manually rotated the flywheel back and forth, feeling the obstruction grind against the impeller blades. After 4 hard cranks, a mangled, wine-soaked cork popped loose from the grinding ring. I pulled it out, wiped off the oily residue, and flicked the breaker back on. The water drained with a loud, relieved suction. Both of them stared at me as if I had performed cardiac surgery on an appliance. "I used to fix the dialysis machines when maintenance was short-staffed," I said, keeping my voice small and mildly surprised at my own competence. "Just an old nursing habit. You get used to troubleshooting things that are trying to kill people." This was the crack I needed. Marshall started treating me like a slightly smarter, marginally useful housekeeper. He left his office unlocked more often, assuming I was too mousy to snoop and too compliant to understand anything I might see. A week later, Diane asked if I could just tidy up the study, while she went to a day spa for a detoxifying wrap. I said yes with a grateful, obedient smile that made my own stomach turn. Inside that office, I moved immediately to the filing cabinet, a steel case lateral model with a built-in 5-pin tumbler lock. Now, my father had taught me to pick locks when I was 12, not for crime, but because he maintained his own vineyard equipment and the tool shed had an old master padlock that jammed every winter. He sat me down on an overturned bucket with a tension wrench and a half-diamond pick and showed me how to listen for the click of each driver pin reaching the shear line. I had kept a small lockpick set in my nursing bag for literal decades, because you would be amazed how many medication carts in a rural hospital have keys lost by the 3rd shift. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applied the lightest clockwise pressure with my left thumb, and slid the pick all the way to the back to lift the rear pin first, standard operating procedure for a lock that gets rarely opened. I listened for the soft, metallic scrape of each pin setting, the subtle give of the plug rotating a fraction of a degree as each shear line aligned. The 4th pin gave me a false set, that distinctive deep click that says you're almost there. I eased off the tension a millimeter, felt the counter-rotation of the plug, and set the last spool pin, the one that always feels mushy if you don't have the right touch. The lock turned. The top drawer slid open with a sound like a cash register drawer releasing. Inside, I found a manila folder labeled in Marshall's blocky handwriting, "LLC dissolution, Lena D." It contained the forged document, a certificate of dissolution for our Vineyard LLC, supposedly signed by me in blue ink, notarized by a woman named T. Gantry, whose commission number traced back to an online notary mill operating out of a virtual office address in Miami. My signature looked convincing at a casual glance, the overall slant, the size of the loops. But the L in my last name swept too high, like a roller coaster peak, instead of the tight, elegant tendril my father always said looked like a grapevine curl. The forgery had the flat, uniform thickness of a scanned image traced with a stylus and then converted to vector. No variation in ink density, no natural pressure points. Behind that sheet was a fully executed bill of sale, transferring all assets of the LLC, including the trademarked brand name Shadow George, the standing grape purchase contracts with 3 local growers, the barrel inventory, and the leased equipment, to Crescent Valley Wine Group for a purchase price of $950,000. And underneath that, the truly devastating document, a loan agreement in my name, using my social security number and a forged signature, for a $120,000 high-interest bridge loan, collateralized by the vineyard property itself, with an acceleration clause that would trigger full repayment within 60 days if the sale did not close. Marshall had personally guaranteed it on a separate page, but he had listed me as the primary obligor, meaning if the deal fell through, the debt would crush me personally, seize my father's land, and leave me holding nothing but a bankruptcy filing with my forged name on it. The man was not just trying to steal my equity. He was constructing a legal trapdoor designed to drop me into a financial abyss the moment he walked away with the cash. I photographed every page with my phone, making sure the metadata on the forged dissolution was visible, including the notary stamp detail and the telltale font artifacts. I then returned the folder to the exact position in the drawer, relocked the cabinet, and went back to dusting the bookshelves as if nothing had happened. My hands did not shake. My pulse stayed at 68. I had seen worse things on night shift, I reminded myself, and the protocol is always the same. Document, preserve, and wait for the right moment to act. That night, while they were watching a home renovation show at excessive volume, I drove out to the storage unit I'd rented under a generic business name on the edge of town. I unlocked the roll-up door, peeled back the moving blanket, and set the miniature barrel on a folding table under a bare LED bulb. I cut the wax seal with a utility knife, small pieces of dark red wax flaking onto the concrete floor like dried blood, and worked the bung out with a flathead screwdriver. The scent that rose from the barrel was cool, woody, and faintly laced with the tannic ghost of a wine that had long since evaporated. Inside, rolled tightly and secured with a rubber band that had petrified into a brittle ring, was the original notarized operating agreement and equity certificate, signed by Marshall, myself, and Dad as guarantor. The notary's embossed seal was crisp. The signatures were in real ballpoint ink with the characteristic micro-ridges of a human hand, and the pages were on heavy, watermarked bond paper. I found the clause that had been my father's legal countermeasure, drafted with the help of the title company he'd used for 40 years. Any dissolution, transfer, or encumbrance of the assets of this limited liability company shall require the unanimous, in-person, wet-ink signature of all equity members, including the guarantor or his estate representative, executed before the title officer of Valley Escrow and Title, Inc., with valid government-issued identification presented and a fresh notarization captured in that same physical location. No electronic or remote notarial acts shall satisfy this requirement. It was a brilliant legal dead man's switch. Because Dad's estate was now in probate and I was the executor, I was the estate representative. Without my physical body standing at that exact title company counter, with my driver's license in hand and my signature given willingly, the sale could not close. The forged dissolution was legally worthless as long as I refused to participate. He had known. He had seen Marshall's soul in a single soil test visit and had built a cage around my inheritance that only I could unlock. The ally reached out to me the following Monday. I received a call from a blocked number, and a calm, measured voice said, "Miss Lena, this is Carol Carver. I'm a senior compliance officer at Valley Escrow and Title. Your father and I worked together on the original deed filing years ago. We've received a request to close a transaction on your vineyard, but the seller's submitted documents show a dissolution certificate that is, frankly, a forensic mess. The notary ID is flagged in our system, and I don't have a valid in-person ID verification for you. The deed restriction your father insisted on is the only thing preventing me from being forced to process this. I cannot kill the deal on my own, but if you can provide me with physical proof of forgery and fraud, I will forward it to our in-house legal counsel and to the FBI's white-collar field office, who I have on standing advisory retainer." I told her I had photographs of the forged documents, the original signed operating agreement, and a handwritten warning from the deceased. She asked me to meet her at a diner off the interstate, a place with neon signage and no security cameras in the parking lot. I drove there that afternoon, wearing a gardening hat and sunglasses, and slid into a vinyl booth across from a woman in her late 60s with a steel gray bun and the kind of calm, analytical eyes that have seen 1,000 fraudulent warranty deeds. She reviewed my evidence on a tablet, her face revealing nothing for a full 3 minutes. Then she nodded once. "This is enough for a grand jury subpoena," she said. "But we need one more thing. The FBI forensic accountant wants metadata from the computer that generated the forged dissolution. Timestamps, IP addresses, the original scanned signature file, the font substitution logs. If I give you a small USB device that looks like an ordinary key fob, can you plug it into his laptop? It will auto-execute a silent forensic imaging tool that copies the document metadata and network session logs. You need physical access for maybe 30 seconds, no more." She handed me a small black USB drive attached to a key ring with a plastic grocery store membership tag. "Just plug it in, wait for the light to stop blinking, and then remove it. Do not under any circumstances click anything on the screen. I slipped the key fob into my pocket. I'll find a window, I said. I found that window during the maximum cruelty beat, but first, I had to stage a test. I needed to know if there was a single sliver of humanity left in either of them, some buried impulse of family or conscience that might give me pause. So on a Wednesday afternoon, around 2 p.m., while both were home and Marshall was working on his laptop in the kitchen's breakfast nook, I prepared. I drank a glass of crushed ice water to lower my core temperature slightly, and I tucked a tiny piece of frozen blueberry inside my cheek, the juice ready to color my lips a cyanotic blue. I walked into the kitchen, stood near the island, and then let myself collapse. I didn't just flop. I mimicked a classic SD segment elevation myocardial infarction, clutching my chest with a clawed left hand, knees buckling, a choked gasp, and then a full, heavy sprawl onto the limestone floor, my breathing rapid and shallow, my eyes half closed and unfocused. The frozen blueberry dissolved against my gum, and I let a thin trail of purple-tinted saliva escape the corner of my mouth. To any observer, I was a woman in her late 50s experiencing a widowmaker heart attack, seconds from circulatory collapse. Marshall looked up from his laptop. He saw me lying on the floor, my chest barely moving. He didn't stand. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't speak. He simply closed the laptop, pushed back his chair, and stepped over my body. His loafer, a brown leather driving shoe with a rubber nub sole, brushed against my hip as he passed. He yanked open the drawer where I'd been pretending to organize estate paperwork and fished out the durable power of attorney form I had conspicuously left unsigned on top. "Where's the pen?" he said, not a question, just a flat demand. Diane walked in from the hallway, holding her phone in a ring light selfie grip. She looked at me on the floor, her expression flickering for maybe a half second, then she turned to Marshall. "Is she dead? If she's dead, we need to call the lawyer first, not the ambulance. The POA dies with her, you idiot. Did you get the signature?" They argued for another 12 seconds about the legal sequence of notification, stepping around me as if I were an inconvenient piece of furniture. I lay there, counting my own steady pulse in my wrist, and I understood. They would let me die to save their scheme. In fact, my death would solve a problem. That knowledge was a cold, clarifying blade that cut through every residual nerve still twitching with family loyalty. They went back into the hall, presumably to retrieve a pen or a witness signature line. I heard their footsteps retreat. The moment the hallway went quiet, I sat up, moved with absolute silence to Marshall's laptop, and plugged the USB key fob into the side port. The tiny LED blinked amber for a nerve-wracking 14 seconds, then went solid green. I pulled it out, tucked it into my bra, and was back on the floor in exactly 23 seconds, resuming my dying pose with the blueberry residue still staining my lips. They returned, found me unresponsive, and Diane finally, begrudgingly, called 911, though she canceled when I miraculously revived 2 minutes later, sitting up and saying, "I think I just fainted. I'm so sorry, so embarrassing." The paramedics never came. Marshall looked almost disappointed, the POA form still unsigned in his hand. The USB drive was now burning a forensic hole in my undergarment, and the FBI had their evidence. The confrontation arrived 2 days later, on a Friday morning that Marshall dressed up as a celebration. He announced over espresso that we were all going to finalize Dad's estate paperwork at the title company, just a formality to release the deed so the land could be properly maintained. He said it cheerfully, the same tone he used to suggest a wine tasting trip. I dressed in my plainest navy nursing slacks, a beige cardigan with a missing button, and sensible rubber-soled shoes that made no noise. In the car, a leased black Mercedes SUV, he handed me a heavy folder and said, "Just sign where the little colored tabs are, sweetheart. It's all for the tax filing and the utilities transfer. You don't need to read the legalese." I leafed through the tabs. It was the forged dissolution certificate, the bill of sale, and a new release of claims indemnifying Marshall against any future lawsuit or estate challenge. A pen, a heavy Mont Blanc, was clipped to the folder. I said nothing. I folded my hands over the folder and stared out the window at the passing rows of Cabernet Franc, the vines just starting to push out their early spring shoots. We were ushered into a conference room at Valley Escrow and Title. The room had a long walnut table, a tray of stale beige cookies, and a window that looked out onto a manicured drainage pond. A young notary, a man in his early 20s with a newly minted commission, sat at the head of the table nervously shuffling his stamp. MS. Carver stood near the back, hands folded in front of her like a bailiff. Two men in plain dark suits, one holding a leather portfolio, stood near the door. They had the posture of men who have served warrants in hostile living rooms. Marshall sat me down in a padded chair, placed the folder on the blotter, and uncapped the Montblanc pen, positioning it at the first signature line. "Just here, here, and here," he said, his hand pressing down on my shoulder with a grip that was just slightly too firm to be affectionate. I picked up the pen, examined its nib, and then set it down with a soft click on the wood. I looked at Marshall with the same expression I used when a surgeon tried to bully the charge nurse into skipping a timeout, calm and utterly unyielding. "I won't sign a dissolution of a company I own 40% of," I said, my voice level and carrying across the table, "on the basis of a document you forged using a scanned image of my signature from a Christmas card, which you traced in Adobe Illustrator, using a font that doesn't even match the natural ink pressure variations of a human hand. Your notary's commission was purchased from an online shell for $29, and the certificate fails to meet the in-person witnessing requirement mandated by the LLC's own operating agreement. The original contract, with all required signatures and a valid embossed notary seal, is in a sealed barrel my father hid in the pump shed. It includes a unanimous consent clause requiring my physical appearance at this exact title company, a clause you clearly never read because you never once asked to see the deed restriction. This room is currently being recorded by the FBI." The two men in suits stepped forward, badges clipped to their belts now visible. The older one, Special Agent Ruiz, a man with gray temples and a quiet, almost apologetic voice, said, "Mr. Marshall Blanchard, you're under arrest for wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, and attempted grand larceny. You too, Mrs. Diane Blanchard, for conspiracy to commit same." Diane started screaming, a high animal wail about how I was an ungrateful lunatic who had always been jealous. Marshall stood frozen, his face draining to the gray-white color of a failed Chardonnay fermentation. He lunged for the folder, trying to grab the forged documents, but Agent Ruiz's partner had already seized the entire contents as evidence, latex-gloved hands moving with the deliberate care of a crime scene technician. The handcuffs made a very final clicking sound that echoed off the walnut paneling. The aftermath was a grinding, months-long process of legal motions, forensic accounting depositions, and pretrial hearings, but the physical evidence was overwhelming. The USB drive I had planted that afternoon yielded a complete forensic image. It showed the forged dissolution was created on Marshall's laptop using a scanned JPEG of my signature, cropped from an old family Christmas card, manipulated in a cracked version of Adobe Illustrator, and printed using a specific inkjet printer registered to his home office. The file creation timestamps matched the period right after my father's oncology appointment when the prognosis was confirmed. The notary service was traced to a known foreign shell company operating out of a virtual mailbox. The bridge loan application had his IP address, his browser fingerprint, and his typo-ridden email address all over it. The forensic accountant also found a hidden spreadsheet projecting his post-sale debt consolidation, which listed my forged loan as eliminated liability, Lena's problem. It was, as MS. Carver later told me with something resembling professional admiration, a file of incompetently clumsy fraud wrapped in a bow. Marshall was charged federally, and facing the glare of the evidence, eventually pled guilty on advice of his public defender after his paid attorney withdrew over non-payment. His allocution statement was a masterclass in false remorse, but the judge, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for despising white-collar schemes that prey on the elderly, sentenced him to 7 years in federal prison, plus 5 years of supervised release, full financial restitution, and the forfeiture of any direct profit from the attempted sale. Diane took a plea deal for accessory after the fact, receiving 3 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and the permanent stain of being listed on the Vineyard Civil Fraud Registry. But the real punishment for her was social. Their country club membership revoked by unanimous board vote, the white Escalade repossessed in the club parking lot, their McMansion sold at auction to satisfy the restitution order, and the bridge loans default. I attended the auction as a spectator, and watched a young family with a pair of border collies buy the house for 52% of its inflated listing price. My father's estate attorney, a man named Gerald, who had drafted the original Vineyard LLC with his own manual typewriter back in the 1990s, helped me petition the court for a creative restitution condition that he called judicially supervised poetic justice. The judge approved it. As the court-appointed victim representative, I requested that Marshall serve his 5-year parole obligation performing physical labor at the vineyard I now fully owned, under my direct supervision, with all net proceeds from the vineyard's new label allocated toward funding an elder fraud prevention program run by a local legal aid clinic. The judge, who later sent me a personal note on court letterhead that said she admired a good third act, signed the order. I poured every recovered asset into the vineyard. The sale to Crescent Valley Wine Group was voided, and I registered a new federal trademark for the estate. With the help of a small team of actual vintners, including a retired enologist from a nearby university, I ripped out the feral Chardonnay, tilled in gypsum to break up the hardpan, and planted 3 acres of Syrah and 2 acres of Cabernet Franc on the south slope. I renamed the whole operation Grapes of Wrath Vineyard, a name my father would have chuckled at. The first vintage was a bold, tannic red blend we called Forgery No. 523-2023. That's Marshall's federal criminal case number. I had the label designed with that case number in gold foil block print below the wine's name, with a small background watermark of a broken fountain pen. Every single bottle, from the magnums down to the half bottles, carries that number. Wine shops have told me it's a collector's conversation piece. As part of his parole conditions, Marshall reports to the vineyard each morning at dawn during crush season, wearing a bright orange high-visibility shirt that reads Crushed Trust in reflective black lettering on the back, a design I had pre-approved with his parole officer. He stomps grapes in the open-air concrete lager, the traditional foot-treading method we use for the premium field blend, 1,000 pounds of destemmed Syrah beneath his bare feet. The fermentation temperature and skin contact protocol are instructions he receives each morning from our winemaker, and he is not permitted to deviate. Tourists watch him from the tasting room deck, sipping a glass of the very vintage he helped inadvertently create, and some take selfies with him in the background, his expression a dull mask of forced compliance. He cannot speak to anyone without my express permission. The dignity of honest, physical labor was something my father believed in deeply, and I am giving Marshall every opportunity to earn it, one barefoot stomp at a time, under a hot Columbia Valley sun. My father's foresight saved me, but it was a quieter lesson he left behind that I carry now. True integrity is not a posture you strike when someone is watching. It is a root system that grows deep enough to survive the driest season, and it never depends on the validation of the people who would cut you down for their own profit. He built a legal cage out of ink, paper, and a sealed barrel because he trusted my intelligence to find it, and my spine to act on it once I did. There was no rage, no dramatic shouting match, just the slow, methodical dismantling of a man who believed he could steal a life because his victim was supposed to be too broken to resist. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Tell me in the comments. If you believe that honest labor and hard-won justice matter more than any quick inheritance built on a forgery, hit like and subscribe. I'll be back next time with another story of betrayal, recovery, and the quiet, detailed mechanics of setting things right. Until then, guard your roots.